Hi. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here. So as you just heard, so my name is Mirjana, and I do research in basically how the brain supports language, so that we have this sort of unique capacity that really, we are the only species that has the ability to communicate in this way, that we can sort of combine a finite set of words that we know into effectively an unlimited set of ideas and messages, so we can basically express anything. And then part of that research is looking into effectively what happens when we throw another language in the mix. So we have another sort of set of labels, and is that going to change the underlying systems that are supporting our language capacity? And what I was planning to talk about today is to give you an overview of some of the sort of key findings in this area of how bilingualism affects cognition, talk about some of our recent findings from my lab that I think are quite nicely complementing that picture, and then obviously discuss a little bit about what possible implications does that have for education. So starting off with just basically setting up the scene. So bilingualism has been a topic of intense attention, so both in sort of scientific circles and in popular media in the last, I would say, 3 to 4 decades. And part of the reason for that is that, the world is just getting globalized. So, there is internet, we're getting in touch with more people, so it's just becoming more and more obvious, this sort of, other people speaking other languages and the need to communicate. But even without those sort of more recent advances, there are things like this. I should just sort of put a few numbers here for you to have a look. So there is something like 6,000 languages that have been identified around the world for something like 190 independent countries. And just putting those two figures next to each other is going to make it obvious that there are going to be people in these countries that are speaking more than one language. So you can think of countries that have multiple official languages, so Switzerland or India, for instance. And some of these languages are going to be huge, so they're going to have millions or billions of speakers. Some are going to be tiny. They're just going to have a family, a region, village, but multiple languages that's being spoken. And there are estimates that there are probably more bilingual than monolingual speakers in the world. And if we look at how the EU is doing, you can see it's not doing too badly. So there are these occasional surveys that are done. And one from 2012 seems to suggest that, or show rather, that there is over half of the general population that can communicate in another language, to some extent. I mean, they're not fully proficient and fully balanced, but they can use another language. And then if we look at the younger populations of students, this really shoots up. This goes to something like 80%. So as a result of these things, we are, have more and more children that are sort of growing up in an environment where bilingualism is sort of their first language, if you want. So you'd basically, have this context where one parent speaks one language, another parent speaks another language, and then from the onset, kids are used to this idea that there are sort of two sets of labels for the same thing. So depending on who you talk to, it's going to, you're going to need to use a different word. So before we start looking into what possible effects this might have on one's cognition, and you can imagine that this might have some effect, it's sort of necessary to, I think, define what do we mean by bilingual here. And as I was just showing you now, obviously there is going to be a number of children who are growing up in this sort of environment where one parent speaking one language, another parent speaking another language. And these bilinguals, well, these kids, they tend to, statistically, not necessarily in every single case, but they sort of tend to grow up into fully proficient bilinguals that are balanced, that can sort of effortlessly switch between their languages, to the frustration of all us others who are really struggling to learn that second language fluently. And then there is a whole other set of scenarios in which people are going to acquire a second language later in life. So obviously, you're going to have children who are learning at some point in their education, and this is going to depend on which education system they attend. So this can be at age of 5 or 15, or anything in between. And then there are adults who would be learning language at some point later in life because they're either particularly interested, or they are, say, moving from one country to another, so that they need to, for personal or job reasons. So they need to learn the second language in order to sort of function in that environment. Or there are going to be people who don't have the choice. So basically, the refugees that are going to be moving to another country and need to learn the second language to some extent. And they are known as sequential bilinguals. So they're acquiring their languages one after another. And these are, these sort of obvious points to make. So this is something that you would know from everyday experience. But I'm flagging this up to make this point that bilinguals are a very, very heterogeneous group. So there are going to be differences in how early people have started learning the second language, why they are doing it, how they feel about it, how proficient they are, how often they use their first and second language, and so on. And all of those are necessary to take into account when one is thinking about what possible effects this does have on one's cognition. So in a way, again, very common sense point, but really, I'll return to this a number of times in the talk to underline the importance of these factors, really. So why would, what affects how we, the effects on our cognition. Right. And bilingualism, when you look at it sort of in a very wide context, it has clear advantages. And I don't think this is any news to any of you. I'm probably sort of preaching to converted here. But being bilingual is going to, if nothing else, it's going to allow you to speak to more than one group of people, right? So it's just sort of broadening those communication capacities. That normally tends to go hand in hand with cultural understanding. So sort of being able to talk to someone in their language is normally going to get people to sort of better understand where people are coming from. So you know their set of beliefs and you understand them a little bit better. So there is that obvious advantage. Job prospects. So someone speaking English and Spanish and German and French, for instance, is going to be in a much better position when they're trying to find a job, comparing to a person who only speaks one language. So again, fairly is obvious point. Travel opportunities and so on. So this all sort of, again, makes perfect sense in that sort of greater social context. But what are the effects on cognition? So this is what I'll be focusing on for the rest of the talk. And I think in order to give you an overview of the key findings, I thought it's very informative and important to give you a little bit of a sort of historical overview here. So how the thinking in this field has developed over the last decades. And it turns out that the first systematic studies that started looking into effects of bilingualism and cognition were basically showing that bilingualism is bad for you. So I'll give you one example. So here is a study from early 1900s that looked at the performance on an IQ test for monolingual and bilingual kids. And what you can see here is that the bilingual kids in a particular environment showed a sort of marked disadvantage in this particular test. So I'm flagging this up because this is an example of a study that didn't necessarily take into account those background variables that I was just flagging up as being really important. So if you do not take into account things like educational availability of educational environment, socioeconomic status, things like that, your results are not necessarily going to be reliable. Because, nourishment and education and those sorts of things are going to affect someone's performance on a test like this. And then any difference between a monolingual and bilingual is basically going to be due to that, rather than them being monolingual or bilingual. For whatever reasons, this was done this way. So either this was sort of lack of, scientific knowledge, or some less charitable reasons you can think of. I'm not going to go into that. But that was sort of the general idea at the time, that it's something that's not particularly desirable. And then that led to these sorts of claims. And I'll read this one for you, it's just fantastic. This goes, "It is, of course, an advantage for the child to be familiar with 2 languages. But without doubt, the advantage may be, and generally is, purchased too dear. First of all, the child in question hardly learns either of the 2 languages as perfectly as he would have done if he had limited himself to one." And note he here, she just wouldn't have stand a chance at all. Secondly, the brain effort required to master the 2 languages instead of one certainly diminishes the child's power of learning other things. So first time I encountered this quote, my immediate association was of another great philosopher of our time, Homer. Every time I learn something new, it pushes some old stuff out of my brain. It's nonsense. There is just no other way to put it. Our brains don't operate that way. So it's not the case that, if you learn how to drive, you're going to forget how to make vegetable soup. It's just simply not. Brains have this sort of amazing capacity to adapt. So you can learn all sorts of things, and, this is what we're going to be looking at. But this was pretty thoroughly debunked, this sort of way of thinking, as I'll show you in a moment. So a change of tide came in the 60s. So you can think of sort of different social, political environment for this at the time. But basically, there was a study that found positive correlation between bilingualism and cognitive performance once all these other factors have been taken into account properly. So socioeconomic status, proficiency, all sorts of other things. And then I think that sort of the current thinking about this can be pretty much summarized along these lines. So 1 language, 1 wheel, gets you places. There's nothing wrong with that. People have functioned like that throughout millennia, happily, efficiently, and so on. You can get a little bit of boost from learning another language. If nothing else, you can go somewhere and not struggle with ordering things off a menu. But having 2 fully balanced wheels is going to give you a boost. Again, even if you don't think from the cognitive perspective, it's job, social, cultural understanding, those sorts of advantages or boosts that you can think about. So that's the background. So in terms of the cognitive consequences, what is the evidence saying? And what I thought would be a useful way to approach this is to sort of go through these 3 major areas, 3 major things. So the first one is the question of when we look in the brain, how are languages represented? And are the same areas involved in processing 1 as compared to 3 or 5 languages? And then move on to how bilinguals are choosing the right language at the right time out of what they have available. And I'll have, I think, maybe a slide or 2 or 1 of each. So this is really just, the essentials of those findings. And then we are going to go and discuss about this sort of potential boosts. And you can see that I've put it in quotation marks, this sort of bilingual advantage, because this has created lots of heat in the literature, and it's probably not entirely helpful to frame it in this particular way, because it sort of implies superiority, and no one really likes that. Evidence doesn't quite sort of fully chime with that. But you're going to go through and see what the data actually say. So focusing on this first question first. So with the neuroimaging, that became available in the last maybe, 40, 50 years, there is now very solid evidence that there is a certain set of regions that are involved in processing language. So when we are speaking or listening or reading and so on, normally the activation is seen in temporal lobes, so on the side, and frontal lobes. Normally stronger on the left, but right hemisphere is also involved. So it's sort of set of frontotemporal regions. So the question is, once we throw another language into that mix, what happens? Is it going to be modified, that sort of underlying architecture? And summarizing across a number of studies here, it turns out that languages are sharing representations. So in other words, the way one language is represented is going to be the same as the second language is going to be represented. And that's, if you think about it, it's not really surprising, because you cannot really expect to have, I don't know, Spanish here and English here, because, you know, they are ultimately referring to the same set of concepts. So if you want to think about, I don't know, a little furry animal that meows, that is going to be the same whether you're calling it cat or you're calling it gat, right? So it sort of makes sense that that sort of shared knowledge is represented. Well, I mean, it's just one set of information, and then the labels are going to be attached to it. So here is one example of a study that I've chosen to show this point. I could have chosen any sort of number of illustrations here, but I think this sort of nicely makes the point. So here is, it's almost 15 years old now, that study. So this is looking at the regions that are supporting language processing. So these are the areas that are in this sort of orangey red color that are activated when people are using their, in this case, first, second, or third language. So these are trilinguals, Dutch, English, French. This is done in Belgium. And this is magnetic resonance imaging, so fMRI study. And what this is showing is sort of brain from the top. So if you can imagine, nose would be here and then ears on the side. But what you can see effectively, it's fairly similar. Well, it's identical, really. So it's the overlapping set of regions, whether people are doing the language task in their first, second, or third language, so Dutch, English, or French. This was done across a number of tasks. So this was when people were listening or talking or reading. What I'm showing here is fluency, so this is when people are sort of producing language. And, I mean, the same story emerges across all these different tasks, that effectively you have sort of the same set of regions that are involved in doing these tasks. So, not much surprise here, I guess. Makes sense. So how do we go on then to choose the right word in the right language at the right time? And this is where I think it becomes interesting, more surprising. So here is one study that, out of many, I guess, that is making this point that languages are actually activated in parallel and they're competing. So this is a classical study in the field from 1999. This is testing Russian-English bilinguals. And they came into the lab, and they have this contraption put on their head. So this is eye tracker. So this is basically allowing us to look with really high precision where exactly people are looking and when. So it's sort of following their gaze. And what's done in the study is people are presented with a grid of this sort. So they're told to manipulate number of objects there, so they're told to manipulate these objects mentally, obviously. So an example would be, I don't know, pick up a marker and put it next to the coin. And you look what they're looking at, where people are sort of looking at while they're doing the task. Now, one thing to note here is this task is done in an entirely monolingual environment. So what I mean by that is, let's say in English here. So participants come in, and they are spoken to, as in instructed what to do in English. They are talking to each other in English. So them being proficient in Russian is sort of neither here nor there for that task. It's using their English knowledge. But what the task actually involved is this manipulation of stamp. Now, why is that relevant? Because in Russian, stamp is marka. And you can hear that that's very similar to marker, right? And the question is that knowledge, even if it's entirely relevant to what they are doing here, going to affect how they do the task? Are they going to be looking at that stamp as they are doing the actual task? And it turns out that they do. So obviously, they're going to be looking at the marker most of the time because that's what they need to do. But then the stamp is also going to be prominent there, much more than coin or the keys, suggesting that, there is that knowledge, even if it is entirely relevant, it's still activated, and it is actually sort of affecting how people are doing the task. So they're competing in parallel to be the drivers of the behavior, of what people actually need to do. And this has been replicated fairly often in the literature. And then, how do we deal with this? How do we not just come up with this sort of garble of different languages? Well, bilinguals seem to be inhibiting one language if they want to talk in the other, so depending what you want to choose. So let's say you want to talk about a cat again. Again, summarizing across many studies, what seemed to be happening is that you could activate that sort of general meaning, and then let's say you are Spanish-English bilingual, and you want to speak in English, you're going to be suppressing the label, the sort of name for it in Spanish in order to produce it in English. So bilinguals are suppressing the non-target language in order to produce the correct one. So that's the background. So the question now is, what effects does this might have on our cognitive performance? And here is this one proposed consequence that is, it's, as I said, potentially really quite lots of influence, lots of impact of that, but that has created lots and lots of discussion in the literature. So the idea goes as follows. So we have this sort of evidence that bilinguals are suppressing one language, and that is going to serve as a sort of mental gym, if you want. So that's going to exercise this ability to suppress information that's irrelevant at any particular context. And that's going to get you better at doing that particular task. So obviously you can sort of, suppress the irrelevant language and focus on the correct one. But then critically, the argument goes, this is going to generalize across domains. So it's not just going to be applicable in the language context, but in any context where there is some interfering information, some competing information that needs to be suppressed. You need to focus on A and suppress B in order to do the task. Situations like you're down like in a bar, and then you're trying to focus on your friend who's talking something, and there's someone else shouting in your ear at the same time. So that is competing information, and that, according to this argument, is going to be improved by the experience of bilingualism. So you can see it's a very bold claim with very profound consequences, because it promises, something quite big as a result of, learning two languages. So what's the evidence for this? Yes, no, or, as you will see in the end what I'll argue, is this a little bit too black and white, a little bit too binary? There is nuance to this that one really needs to take into account. But in any case, let's see what the evidence says. It's been tested across many populations and so on. So I'll give you examples of data from children, adults, and patients. So looking at cognitive control in kids, a type of task that would be used to test this is something like this, Tao's task. So you present kids with these two objects, and you tell them, so these are two Tao blocks. Each one of those has flats. So these blocks are flats, and there is a family living in each one of these flats. So which of the Taos has more people living in it? And you can see the obvious temptation, right? So there is more people living in the higher one. But that's not the case, because there are actually more blocks in this one. And it turns out that bilingual kids are just a little bit better at dealing with this in conflict, sort of suppressing the irrelevant information about size effectively, and saying that the shorter tower is actually going to have more people living in it. So there is some evidence there to suggest that sort of, the experience of bilingualism actually correlates with ability to suppress irrelevant information. Excellent. In adults, so, you obviously cannot use the same task. I mean, it would be a little bit worrying if adults would be in the same way affected by that information. So a similar type of task, well, a task that would be testing similar type of processes, would be something like this. So it's called Simon task. So you bring people in, and you tell them there's a screen, so there is going to be, I'll present either a pink block or a grey block on the screen. And if it's pink, you need to make the response using your left hand, and if it is grey, you need to use your right hand. And then what can be done very simply is to present the pink one that needs to be responded with the left hand on the left-hand side of the screen. So that's easy enough to do, right? And the same for the grey. So that's sort of congruent. There is no conflict when that type of decision is being made. Or you can simply swap them around. So then you present pink on the right-hand side of the screen, but response needs to be made with the left hand because it is, pink. And that creates conflict. That creates this sort of interfering information that needs to be suppressed in order to do the task properly. So then, if we just look at responses in that sort of incongruent context, how do people behave, monolinguals and bilinguals? So here is a type of data that, so it's a study that reported this data. You can see it at the bottom. So what this is showing is performance of monolinguals and bilinguals on this task. So here on the y-axis is how fast people do the task. So to what extent are they actually affected, bothered by the presence of interfering information? So how long it takes to overcome that sort of conflicting information to make the correct response. And the higher the number, the slower people are, the more they're affected by the conflicting information. And you can see here that there is, so monolinguals are in red, bilinguals are in black. There is small but consistent difference between the two groups. So this is in the range of, this is milliseconds, so this is in the range of maybe 100 milliseconds. So it's not something that you'd necessarily notice in daily life, but it is consistent and significant. So monolinguals are more affected by conflicting information, takes them a bit longer to make this sort of response than bilinguals. And then the other thing to note here is on the x-axis. These are ages of participants. So people were tested in their, so it's not the same participants, but there was a group of people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on. So now, this is, let's just take a step back. So we know from, again, lots and lots of literature, that this ability to deal with conflicting information, this sort of cognitive control, is something that declines with aging. I mean, it's unfortunate, but it's natural. It's just everyone's cognitive ability of this sort is declining with aging. And the question is there perhaps some effect of bilingualism on this sort of decline? And what you can see here is that these data seems to suggest yes. So there is this sort of increase in how long it takes people to respond from about 60s onwards in the bilinguals, and it sort of kicks in much earlier in monolinguals. So what this seems to suggest is that monolinguals are showing more decline in cognitive control due to aging than bilinguals. So possibly, some effect of in this sense as well. So again, this is quite cool. I mean, these are very promising data. And then finally, same thing has been looked at in patients. So these are patients with dementia. So progressive disease that affects all sorts of cognitive processes, including cognitive control. And there is about 100 patients in each group, monolingual and bilingual. And then what these researchers have reported is that when they compared the two groups, there is something like 4.5 to 5 years difference in the onset of symptoms in one group over the other. So let me just be crystal clear here, so what this is suggesting. So this is not saying that bilingualism is going to prevent dementia. No, that would be a miracle. I mean, those things don't happen. What this is saying, or the way it was interpreted, is that language experience might be contributing to cognitive reserve. So this sort of lifelong ability to, well, need to suppress the competing information is going to be, in a way, accumulating. And then once something as destructive as sort of dementia kicks in a way, people are going to be better able to suppress that intruding effect, or that is negatively affecting the cognitive performance. So compensating for the effects of neuropathology, right? So this is really quite exciting. So I've been painting a very, very positive picture, as you can see so far. This is really quite promising, quite a lot across different domains. Why has this become a little bit controversial? So what are the possible, reasons against? I guess part of the reason is that it really promises something quite profound, relatively easily. And there is lots of, if you want, goodwill about this idea. So, it has big implications for education and policymakers and so on. And perhaps what some people have been arguing, the evidence hasn't been scrutinized to quite the same extent as some of the things that don't have that sort of immediate appeal and promise. And then, as a result, there's been quite a lot of suggestions of, what you really need to look into in order to sort of validate these results properly. And I'll just flag up a few of these sort of caveats that have been discussed. So the first one is that these effects are not consistently replicated. So some studies would be comparing performance, monolinguals, bilinguals, and these sort of cognitive control, reporting results that, as in reporting a difference, some would not be reporting any difference. And there can be, if you want, fairly simple methodological reasons for this. So some studies just would not have enough participants. They don't have enough power. So then they don't produce a result. Or data acquisition was not quite done in the way it should have been done. There are some things that could be improved there. So these are all very serious problems, but they can be solved. These are things that, you just run another study with more participants, with sort of better data collection and so on. So in a way that could be overcome. What I think are way more serious problems are these two, and they're very tricky to solve properly. The first one is that it's really, really difficult to match your groups on the relevant variables. So things like socioeconomic status. So I was saying earlier, if one group is consistently underperforming because they don't have access to educational system the same way that another group has, that is going to affect their performance. Or this one is an interesting one that's been discussed quite a lot. Immigration status. So this is generalizing widely, so there's a statistical trends rather than any individual points. But countries that do these sorts of research are countries that can afford to do this sort of research, right? So they're going to be better developed countries. Those countries, by default, are going to have people coming in for work from elsewhere. And again, generalizing, but people coming in from somewhere are going to be more likely to be bilingual than people who stay put. So if you just compare the two groups without taking into account their immigration status, for instance, you are likely to have some effects of cultural, motivational, socioeconomic differences that will all reflect themselves in how people do the task, that will not necessarily have to do much with them being bilingual or not. So, a very important thing to bear in mind. And then finally, there is this chicken and egg, so causality versus correlation versus causality problem. So let's say we do find consistent effects of consistent link between bilingualism and performance on these sorts of tasks. And one can make an argument that I have been making so far that this is because you need to be suppressing one language, and that is going to exercise this ability, and you're going to get better at doing these sorts of things across the board. So that's that argument. But equally, what's possible is to turn that argument on its head and say, well, cognitive capacity is something that naturally varies in population. So some people are going to be better at this, some people are going to be worse. Just that's the normal thing. So what's there to say that people who have cognitive capacity, better cognitive capacity, are going to be better able to acquire another language, to sort of start learning something that is going to be tricky, that's going to be interfering with what you already know with your first language, and stick with it. So in a way, you know, is it the case that bilingualism influences cognition, or is it that pre-existing cognitive capacity is determining, or affecting the likelihood of learning the second language? So in that sense, it's really difficult to dissociate, you know, what's driving what. And those are the sort of, I think in my mind, my opinion, most important caveats that have been raised about this idea of cognitive advantage due to bilingualism. Okay, so I'll now move on to another couple of things that have been discussed in the literature. So the first one is metalinguistic knowledge. So again, an idea that this is something that benefits from bilingualism. So metalinguistic knowledge it's not knowledge of language, but knowledge about language. So this is not, you know, how many words you know and how fast you can use them, but it's more sort of abstract knowledge of this is a system, that you have labels for things, they can be combined in certain ways and so on. So I'll just give you an example of what I actually mean by this. You know, we have a concept, and everyone knows the concept. But what metalinguistic knowledge is going to tell you is that there is nothing intrinsic in this label that links to this concept. So these particular three letters, or the combination of those, you know, that there isn't anything that linking it intrinsically to the concept of dog. Or, I'll give you an example, you can have some really big words, minuscule, it's huge, it's referring to something small. Or you can have like big, it's referring to something, you know, small word to something big. So in the same way, there isn't that sort of direct link. It's effectively idiosyncratic, what a link between a label and the concept. And that obviously becomes, you know, clear when you take into account that that same concept has been called different things, depending on which language you use. And the idea is that this is something that bilinguals just by default are going to be sort of grasping easier, because there isn't that sort of direct link between that label and that object. And I'll show you one study that tested this, and I think it's beautifully elegant. So this was done in South Africa in the 70s, and there were kids, and they were asked two questions. So the first one is, could you call a cow dog and a dog cow? So in other words, can you just randomly decide to swap labels for things? The answer is no, you can't, because it's going to create confusion. You know, you can't just decide you don't like it, and, you know, I don't like cats being cats any longer. They're going to call them coconuts from now on. Just not done. However, so that's no. Suppose you are making up names for things. Can you, in that case, call cow dog and dog cow? So in other words, there isn't this prior agreement in the society that there is a particular label for a particular concept. Can you do this? And the answer is yes. There isn't anything to prevent you to call these things this way. So this is asked of kids, and there were 4 to 6-year-olds and 7 to 9-year-olds that were either monolinguals or bilinguals. And here is the sort of range of possible responses. So kids can just say, oh, don't be ridiculous. You know, it's no to both of those. You can't just go around doing these sorts of things. They can agree to both. They can do all sorts of things. The inconsistent category is where they were asked a number of these questions, number of pairs. So cow, dog, I don't know, water, book, and so on. So the inconsistent is where they change their mind depending on which particular group, which particular pair they're talking about. And And what I'm showing here is the percentage of responses in each of these categories. And you can see that at this early age, most kids are just going to, the responses are going to be all over the place. They're going to be changing their mind depending on which particular pair you're talking about. But this is the combination that we're actually interested in. And you can see that bilinguals are more likely to grasp this, that you can do these sorts of things, this sort of break the direct linkage between a label and a concept. And then when you go up to 7 to 9-year-olds, this really shoots up. So again, suggesting that, this sort of metalinguistic knowledge, this ability, if you want to break the, crudely said, literal links between concept and a label, is something that bilinguals, just by their experience of being bilingual, are more likely to be able to understand. And then the final one is what's known as theory of mind. So theory of mind is, it's sort of knowledge about other people's beliefs, or awareness that other people might know things differently from you, and as a result, they might be behaving differently than you are behaving. So it's just awareness of, not everyone knows the same things as I do. And this is something that just develops over time. So your average 3-year-old is going to assume that everyone knows what they know, and they should be behaving, so they're going to be surprised if you do something that sort of doesn't agree with their view of the world. Tested in these sorts of this typical test here. So you would have scenario, 2 characters introduced. So I say there is a Sally, there is Anne, and Sally takes a toy, puts her in her basket, and then she goes away. And then Anne, being mischievous, she moves toy from basket to the box. Sally comes back. So then you ask the child, so where is Sally going to look for her toy? And there is a conflict here, because the child knows that the toy has been moved. So they know that, they should look in the box. But Sally doesn't know that, because she's been away when this has been happening. So her natural reaction would be to look where she left it. So whose perspective is the child going to take? Like, will they grasp that Sally knows, that child knows something that Sally doesn't? And it turns out that, again, bilingual kids are just a little bit better at grasping this. Different beliefs, they're going to be driving to different types of responses. So it's not all positive. So all I've been showing you so far, it is suggesting positive effects. But again, there is fairly consistent evidence across the board that there are disadvantages. So the first one of them is the size of vocabulary. And this is going to be reflecting itself in these sorts of tasks. So you get a child and you tell them, here are 4 actions, pictures of 4 actions. So which one of them is referring to plumbing? And a bilingual kid is going to be a little bit worse than a monolingual child in answering this question. And the sort of logic of explaining this type of thing is I think, fairly straightforward. So the idea is that if you only have one set of labels for objects, for plumbing, for instance, you're going to be using that more often. You're going to be accessing that particular label more frequently than in the case when you have 2 labels for the same concept. So then you're going to be sort of splitting your usage between language 1 and language 2. So in other words, there's just sort of that frequency of how often you use the word that is going to make it just a little bit more effortful to actually access it properly. So it's a sort of frequency effect. And then there are some lifelong consequences. So one of them that's really, really frustrating is how often or how vulnerable bilinguals are to what's known as a tip of the tongue. So it's that sort of really frustrating experience where you sort of know the word, you know that you know it. You can know, it's long, it has 3 syllables, it starts with M or something like that, but you just cannot come up with the label when you need it. And this is normally something that is triggered by words that you've learned, but you don't use on a daily basis. So something that's, again, not very frequently accessed. So an example of this sort of thing would be, what's the name of the process by which plants make their food? So other than biology teachers, I guess, it would be something that you sort of encountered at some point, but not normally using on a daily basis. So I don't know if anyone is having the experience of tip of the tongue and photosynthesis. But it's just sort of those a little bit less used words that are known, but not really. And when we compare monolinguals and bilinguals and how often they experience tip of the tongue, it turns out that bilinguals are experiencing it significantly more often. But then, interestingly, there is always but, this only seemed to apply for objects, but not for names. And the possible explanation here is that if someone is called John, they're going to be called John whether you are a Spanish or English speaker. So you're not going to be splitting the usage of that word depending on which language you're using. So again, you have this sort of, the frequency of accessing and how difficult that makes it is what's driving this particular effect. So to summarize, clear benefits of bilingualism across many personal, economic, social, cultural dimensions and so on. So I guess there is no serious argument to suggest otherwise, so overwhelmingly outweighing costs. When we look in this sort of neuro-cognitive domain, what does that do to our brain and our cognitive functioning? There is evidence for effects of cognitive control, metalinguistic knowledge, theory of mind, but some of it needs to be scrutinized, so some of it is still controversial. Costs on vocabulary, speed of and ease of retrieval, but critical influence of these other variables that really need to be taken into account if one is seriously to look into any differences between those. Right, so last few minutes. Possible implications for classroom. So what has been discussed then, you would have much more experience of this. So if there is data to suggest, and there seem to be, that there is some effect on the ability to manage conflicting demands. This is clearly beneficial, right? So I think this is a fairly common sense argument that, being able to focus on something, focus your attention to not be distracted by interfering information and so on. This has been shown in study after study that this has positive consequence for whether it's maths or reading or basically a whole range of disciplines. So that's obvious in a way. The less obvious one, but I think equally interesting, are these two. So sensitivity to social cues. So this is what I was showing you now with this sort of theory of mind, being able to sort of understand others' beliefs, or just in general context of sort of in order to choose which language to use, you need to be aware of the environment, as in who you're talking to, what you're talking about, and so on. And it has been argued that this can be sort of capitalized upon, this can be used to boost knowledge. So bilingual kids are going to be, this is sort of their trait from the experience of being bilingual. So they're going to be sort of very well prepared to learn from social contexts, from environment, from, interaction, role play, joint activity, and those sorts of things. So in a way, pre-existing trait that can be used in order to boost acquisition of knowledge. And then we have this sort of metalinguistic knowledge, so this knowledge of language and sort of more abstract, not direct link between a label and a concept. So again, it has been argued that this can be used to promote deeper understanding of semantic, of categories, so how to learn language. So for instance, if you are introducing different breeds of dogs, so if you just look at these, they look very different from each other. And having this sort of direct link, okay, so here is a dog, is going to exclude this. But sort of not having that one-to-one mapping is going to potentially allow deeper understanding of concepts, so extracting what is the critical, what's the essence of a category, right, of a dog or any other concepts. So in a way, pre-existing traits that can be used to promote deeper understanding of concepts and creation of categories. And just at the very beginning, I'm going to show you some very recent data from my lab, where we decided to go beyond this sort of who's better, bilingual advantage. So our monolingual is going to be performing better than bilinguals and so on. And to look at what are the actual effects of the constellation of our neural networks, of the sort of neural, well, exactly, the sort of the underlying brain networks that are supporting these processes. So we turned to neuroimaging and using EEG. So this is a method that allows us to look and so basically in real time how the brain works. So these are sort of the data that tell you activation in each one of these electrodes over time. And we are interested in looking at how bilingual and monolingual brains are encoding information and critically when they are performing exactly the same. So we give them the task where there isn't, you're worse, you're better. They're doing exactly optimally, they're both doing equally well, but is there any difference in the underlying networks? So we put them in this sort of task where, similar to what I was telling you earlier, so you're in a bar and then you want to focus on your friend who's saying something, but there is someone being really annoying and is sort of shouting in your ear. And we tell our participants, focus on, let's say, the blue speaker, ignore the red one. And they're simply listening to these narratives. So they're perfectly able to do this. They can focus on one. We ask them afterwards, so we play them some children's stories. So this is easy enough to understand, they don't need to comprehend some sort of complex ideas. And these are all Cambridge students, so they spend lots of time in pubs. They're perfectly able to do these sorts of tasks, right? They're focusing on one person while getting rid of the other. So they're performing equally well. There is no behavioral difference between them. And this is work of my excellent doctoral student, Andrea Olguin. So this is the task. So they are in this environment. We're taking their brain measure, brain activity. So we tell them, here is a story A. They're hearing both of these things simultaneously, but we tell them, just focus on story A and ignore what's in your idea. And then we counterbalance these, or swap them around to make sure everything is counterbalanced. And then we play with what we are actually presenting as interference. So we either give them another story in the same language. So let's say they're listening to a narrative in English, we play them another narrative in English. So that's quite confusing. We play them a story in a language that they don't understand. So they know it's a language, say Serbian, but they're not going to be able to understand what this is. Or we just give them some sort of acoustic noise that is matched in terms of acoustic properties, but that happens not to mean anything. And then we simply correlate the story, sort of exactly attended speech, with the brain data. So we get these time series, and then we simply correlate them in each of the electrodes. So basically the question is, to what extent is this encoded in the brain data? So these sort of stories. And we tested this in monolinguals and in bilinguals. So there is about 25 people in each of these groups. And what these data tell us is that for monolinguals, when they are attending to speech, there's going to be strongest correlation, strongest encoding of the attended story when the interference is difficult, when the interference is in the same language. So that's the sort of the most difficult listening environment. So it makes sense. Less so in the case when the interference is in a language they don't understand, and least when the language, it's noise or something that they just cannot make any sense out of. And then, looking at bilinguals, basically we see this. So whether they're Spanish English or Dutch English bilinguals, we tested both, we see no difference in the amount, in how strongly the brain data correlating with the speech data, so how strongly they're encoding the information in order to understand. So the way we interpreted this is that monolinguals are boosting the encoding in order to produce the information, to understand these stories. Bilinguals do not show the same effect, but they are both doing equally well. So they can both do the task optimally, there's no question of sort of decreased performance. It's just that the underlying system seems to be slightly organized slightly differently. What might this mean? Bilinguals' brains encoding information differently than monolinguals. Even if they're achieving equal performance, they're both doing equally well. So this is opening this really interesting interpretation that there is a different constellation of skills in one group over the other. The obvious implication of this, even if this is at the moment more questions than answers, is, are these fully met, fully harnessed in the current educational system, right? So this is something that we're going to be doing lots of research on in the coming years. So I'll just summarize. So major advantages in developing bilingual proficiency, but it's a complex picture. So lots of things need to be taken into account, not to basically be, there is hype that to deal with the hype. Effects on cognitive control, metalinguistic knowledge, theory of mind. Some of it is controversial, but this is the really interesting one, that there is this possible different constellation of capacities that are clearly reflecting how the brain actually deals with this sort of major environmental demand, effectively, that's bilingualism, that, as I was saying, potentially has profound implications for across the board, education and so on. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention and any questions.